Welcome back to the Beesness, honeys. We are 1 week further into March and 1 week deeper into its headlines. Without further ado, I will just remind you, as always, that our source doc is available for your viewing, and get straight to the buzz. We had 4 noteworthy follow-ups last week. First, the ACLU has sued the National Endowment for the Arts for enforcing Trump's DEI mandates. On Thursday, March 6th, the ACLU's Rhode Island offshoot filed a lawsuit on behalf of several theaters, which mostly refers to theatrical productions, but its outcome might affect any related exhibitions, namely art exhibitions featuring works by non-binary or trans artists. The ACLU claims the NEA's new policy, which requires funding applicants do not, quote, promote gender ideology, end quote, as well as enforcement of it, will limit the artworks which may be publicly shown by such applicants in an illegal manner. As you may guess, and ACLU senior staff attorney Vera Edelman, leading the lawsuit, confirmed, it argues more specifically that the mandate violates First Amendment protections as well as administrative procedural law. The suit reads in part, according to Art News, quote, President Donald Trump's January executive order was an, inner quotes, unlawful and unconstitutional exercise of executive power that has sowed chaos in the funding of arts projects across the United States, end quote. This headline caught our attention, honeys, because this may be the first direct legal challenge to the sitting president's executive order. Plus, as our sources note, it comes right in the middle of widespread concern about, quote, whether the policies of the Trump administration will lead to a crackdown on what kinds of art can be shown, end quote. We're already seeing this concern validated when we think about what's happened with the Smithsonian and the National Gallery of Art dismantling their DEI efforts, plus the 2 canceled Art Museum of the Americas shows that we covered last Beesness. It appears we spoke too soon last week when we celebrated that a queer nun and priest portrait show gaining controversy in Mexico had not yet been censored. It now is via judge order. Contemporary artist Fabian Chairez reported March 5th on social media that his exhibition, La Venida del Señor, or The Coming of the Lord, featuring suggestive portraits of queer priests and nuns and hosted at a public university's gallery in Mexico City, has been suspended per a judge's orders only 2 days before its scheduled closure. This was largely due to a formal legal complaint made by the Association of Christian Lawyers as well as the university's Catholic community, who saw the exhibition as Christianophobic and blasphemous, in their own words. Judge Francisco Javier Rebolledo Peña, head of the 6th District Court for Administrative Matters in Mexico City, granted the order which mandated that the university suspend access to the exhibition within 24 hours, quote, or face the use of public force for its closure, end quote. The university subsequently notified the artist, who stated that he has felt unfairly left out of this process. As our source for this story, Hyperallergic, puts it, quote, Chairez said his exhibition, quote, had been subjected to censorship, end quote, calling the suspension, quote, not only an attack on my work, but also the fundamental right to freedom of expression, the cornerstone of any democratic society, end all quotes. There was a bit of good news as well, though, honeys. The Brooklyn Museum has extended its timeline for its widely criticized layoffs after another rally over the last week. On March 6th, over 150 people, again led by unions representing the 47 workers whose jobs are in peril, gathered outside the building at noon in the second protest in as many weeks regarding sweeping layoffs set to go into effect Sunday the 9th. DC 37 Local 1502 President Wilson Suffrant told the crowd, quote, we should be at the table enjoying lunch, but the museum put us out here because they created a deficit and they want to balance that deficit on the back of our unions, end quote. Though the Brooklyn Museum has repeatedly claimed to be complying with the 30-day notice union requirements, Michael Gallardi, an assistant objects conservator of 4 years, told Hyperallergic at the rally, quote, it's been about 4 weeks since they announced this layoff, and I have personally not gotten any sort of written notice that I have been laid off, so no, they are not in compliance at all, end quote. Later that same evening, Director Ann Pasternak sent an email to all staff announcing a 1-week extension of the layoff timeline as the institution received news of possible city funding, which came up during the February 28th special oversight hearing by the City Council's Committee on Civil Service and Labor. Our sources seem to indicate that effective questioning by Henry A. Garrido, Executive Director of District Council 37, one of the 2 unions at the museum, surrounding the urgency of the layoffs in light of the city's budget timeline, may have turned the outcome in their favor. Maida Rosenstein, president of UA Local 2110, the other union involved here, Chair stated, quote, "We appreciate the elected officials and our fellow unionists in DC 37 AFSCME who work toward this funding. It's now up to the museum to work with both our unions to save jobs and strengthen the museum," end quote. We will keep you posted with what happens in this 1-week extension. And last week, Christie's held its AI art sale, which defied controversy and surpassed expectations. Occurring on March 5th and titled Augmented Intelligence, the sale brought in over $728,000, with many works selling above their estimates and 28 out of the 34 available lots sold. Nicole Sales-Giles, Christie's VP and Director of Digital Arts Sales, expressed satisfaction that the project reached its aims of spotlighting brilliant creative voices, pushing the boundaries of technology and art, and to get the wider community of collectors especially to recognize their influence and significance in today's landscape. Christie's confirmed about 37% of bidders were first-timers at the auction house, and almost 48% of bidders were millennials and Gen Z. Another part worth mentioning is that the artist Alexander Reben set up a robot program to paint a little more with each bid at the auction. It's unclear if this was specifically on the robot or any bid at all, but by the end of the evening, Reben's machine had produced over $8,000 worth of painting. And as I just hinted at, honeys, we care about this headline because, as Arts News points out, while some digital artists celebrated and supported the sale, others criticized it as an embodiment of the ongoing struggle between human artistry and machine-driven innovation. No matter the opinions and the controversy, the sale results indicate that AI art is becoming a permanent part of the art market. We saw a special focus last week on how Trump's new tariffs will affect art professionals and art supplies in the U.S. and abroad as they went into effect. Our sources report that everyone from museum directors to art shippers say they are scrambling to adjust operations and fully understand the impact of the tariffs on future sales as well as acquisitions. As our sources explain, prior to midnight on March 4th, works of art, antiques, and collector's items imported from Canada and Mexico were previously duty-free under the U.S. harmonized tariff schedule, but now they will have official tariffs of 25% as well as an additional tariff of 10% for all imports from China on top of existing duties. Art world entities are especially concerned with the increased costs and more difficult process of selling, transporting, and exhibiting art when some, namely galleries, have already spent months planning their participation in international art fairs like Art Basel Hong Kong, Independent, Frieze New York. They must now start over on much shorter notice. Hyperallergic reports art supply retailers and manufacturers, plus artists and educators, are all concerned about how to navigate rising costs and inventory impacts in order to continue their schooling, to continue to produce their livelihoods. Golden Artist Acrylics CEO Mark Golden explained that even made in U.S. products, and therefore U.S. businesses, will be affected because components like pigments may come from elsewhere. Counter tariffs newly being introduced by China and Canada are bound to make the whole thing even more costly and complex. When we consider weak foreign exchange rates for Canadian dollars and Mexican pesos, we see how this problem could compound for many art professionals. Consider it this way, honeys, quote, "A work priced at US $10,000 would cost over 14,000 Canadian and over 209 Mexican thousand before the 25% tariff. But with it, the cost balloons to over 18,000 Canadian and over 261,000 Mexican peso," end quote. The Art newspaper published an in-depth article as well last week on what the new tax might mean, particularly for Canada's market, because according to writer Daniel Grant, they could be hit the hardest, being so dependent on the cross-border flow of dealers, collectors, and artworks. We see an example in art dealer Stephen Bulger, who told Art News he had to cancel plans to show a Canadian artist at the iPad Fair in New York next month because the 25% tax, quote, "puts us at a severe disadvantage," end quote. Efforts are already being made by figures and institutions across the art world to shift professional relationships to be less U.S. art market dependent, even if tariffs are reduced in the future, with some of the biggest effects remaining to be seen. We also heard last week that the Notre Dame is raffling off its own stones to support religious heritage in France. The famed medieval medieval Catholic cathedral is raffling off around 50 of them total, which were too badly damaged in the 2019 fire to reuse in its repairs. Those eligible to participate are people age 18 and up who donate at least €40 or $43 to a website set up by the French Heritage Foundation, established in 1996 to support the preservation of France's religious heritage via a specific website. Each of the stones weighs about 800 grams or about 1.7 pounds, and they've been engraved with the silhouette of the iconic structure's main facade. Winners will be selected before the anniversary of the 2019 fire on April 15th, but are explicitly prohibited from selling, gifting, or trading the stones. The Heritage Foundation has already raised over €228 million or 247 million US of its 840 million or 912 US million goal from nearly 236,000 donors, which will go to the approximately 5,000 chosen religious sites in the country most in need of repairs. I don't know about you, honeys, but that seems worth it to me. I might be entering and I'll let you know what happens. And now one of the more bizarre headlines I've ever reported. 3 piglets were stolen last week from an art installation in which they were left to starve. The exhibition was by Chilean-born and Denmark-based Marco Evaristi and was housed within a former butcher's warehouse in Copenhagen. The work was titled "And Now You Care" and was intended to shine a light on the ethical issues associated with the extra scrutinized pig farming practices of Denmark. The artist himself is known for especially shocking body-based works. For example, he's previously made meatballs out of his own liposuction harvested fat. The piglets, housed in a cage, were exhibited alongside his paintings of slaughtered pigs on Danish flags and were not provided with food or water, thus ensuring they would die of starvation. Evaristi claimed that without the piglets, the show would have been, quote, boring, end quote. As we can imagine, this caused some public uproar, especially among animal rights groups. Gitte Butchev, director of the World Animal Protection's Danish arm, officially stated, quote, "We understand Marco Evaristi's intention with his exhibition, but it is not acceptable to protest one form of animal cruelty by committing another," end quote. Evaristi then told the New York Times that the piglets seemed to have disappeared while a cleaning crew was working on Sunday. There are no clues yet as to who is responsible for the piglets' disappearance, but the controversy over the piece is still raging across Denmark. We also heard that the foundation of NVIDIA's CEO has rescued the ailing California College of the Arts with a $45 million boost. The fundraising campaign for that $45 million hinged on a matching gift from the Jen Hussein and Lori Huang Foundation, which doubled the $22.5 million raised by over 50 donors, including trustees, former board members, and alumni. Huang is currently recognized by Forbes as the world's 16th richest person at the time the sources were published, and NVIDIA itself is a tech company who leads in production of the sorts of chips used to power artificial intelligence, among other specialties. Art News points out that this individual gift is among the largest, if not the largest, the school has ever received, and it provides relief from an urgent budget deficit due to financial struggles which emerged as early as 2019 when the school saw a 1/3 drop in its enrollment rates, contributing to a $20 million budget gap, which has since prompted fears of further layoffs as the institution cut 23 jobs or 10% of their staff that year, as well as a potential merger with another school. President David House celebrated the gift but noted that it only fixes the short-term challenges and more is needed to keep the school open long-term, including investments to attract more students. This headline caught our attention, honeys, because the college's challenges can serve as a case study for broader instability in art education, as we've covered within the last year. Think back to the announced closures of the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts and the University of the Arts, on top of the San Francisco Art Institute's 2023 bankruptcy filing. As Art News points out, quote, nationally, MFA program enrollment has declined after years of growth, end quote. The San Francisco Chronicle also reported last week that the city's museums are facing painful budget cuts. News broke that the Fine Arts Museum of San Francisco outlined a plan to weather the city's financial crisis and its resulting 15% reduction of general fund allocations by cutting 23 out of the 99 total positions there, as well as across the De Young Museum and the Legion of Honor, both of which it oversees. It may also decide to close the latter two museums on Tuesdays from here on out. Concerns arose over the consequences of the plan in terms of security, visitor membership, etc. After they submitted the outline to the mayor's office 2 weeks ago, especially as most of the cuts would affect security jobs and other operations positions. It remains to be seen what the final plan will be. We also heard that turmoil continues at Italy's museums as ticketing contracts change hands. Ongoing strikes, union accusations of putting profit over people, and general political outcry since November of 2024 did not sway an Italian court which recently chose to uphold the 2023 decision to entrust ticketing at some of the city's most visited museums, including the Uffizi Gallery, to a new services provider called Coop Culture, which oversees ticketing at 2 other museums in the nation, after a 21-year partnership with Opera Laboratori Fiorentini, a major museum services company employing 1,000 people, which formerly managed the museum's ticketing, outreach, and bookshops. Said Laura Remy and Ghiacci Cristina, regional Democratic Party councilors, at a November protest, quote, "We have submitted numerous demands for clarification from Culture Minister Guili without receiving adequate answers. We are increasingly concerned about the government's inadequate management of cultural heritage," end quote. The Art Institute of Chicago has announced its return of a sacred Buddha statue to Nepal, acknowledging that the 12th century sculpture was stolen from Guitabahi in the Kathmandu Valley. The decision to return it followed new provenance research and collaboration with Nepalese officials. The work in question is titled Buddha Sheltered by the Serpent King Muchalinda to Nepal and depicts the Buddha protected by said Serpent King during a storm, which has been on display at the AIC since 1997. It was first identified by the online heritage activist group Lost Arts of Nepal as matching one stolen from Kathmandu, yet they went uncredited by the Art Institute, which raises questions about whether or not the museum should really be praising itself for this instance of repatriation. As professor of art crime at John Jay College, Aaron Thompson puts it, quote, "It is depending on the unpaid, uncredited work of source country researchers and when dozens of artifacts from the same red flag sources remain apparently unexamined in its collections," end quote. We additionally heard last week that a Charlottesville nonprofit is looking for artists to transform a melted down Robert E. Lee statue. The application for interested artists was put forth as the second phase of the Swords into Plowshares initiative by Jefferson School African American Heritage Center, a Black-led public research nonprofit based in Virginia. The initiative, whose first stage was to melt down the statue in order to use its materials to create a new one, was approved by the Charlottesville City Council in 2021 and was completed 2 years ago. The selection process will be done by jury, who will choose up to 5 semifinalists from the applicants to be given $10,000 to develop design proposals for the new piece. The site of the future artwork is expected to be announced by the end of this year following a survey of local public parks. This headline is attention-worthy because the project follows years of local community petitioning efforts and litigation battles over the infamous Confederate general statue whose dismantling was at the center of the deadly 2017 white supremacist Unite the Right rally. Executive Director of the center, Andrea Douglas, told Hyperallergic, quote, "As members of our federal government divest from historical accountability and attempt to reshape our shared history, it is imperative that institutions like the JSAAHC continue initiatives such as Swords into Plowshares, whose success relies on artists to help us interrogate the continuity of our past, present, and future," end quote. And just a few stories left, honeys. The first 8 never-before-seen short stories by author Harper Lee will be published this year. Typescripts of her early fiction attempts were discovered in her New York apartment after her death in 2016, correcting long-held ideas that her early attempts at fiction and other writings were lost forever. HarperCollins Publishing House has announced that 8 of the early short stories, along with another 8 nonfiction pieces previously published elsewhere, will be readable for the first time in October with the debut of their forthcoming collection, The Land of Sweet Forever, Stories and Essays. If you are a fan of To Kill a Mockingbird, we highly recommend you put this on your calendar. We also heard from some eagle-eyed experts last week that they've solved the mystery of a missing masterpiece half a century after it was stolen. Peter Bruegel's famous 17th century oil painting, Woman Carrying the Embers, vanished from the National Museum in Gdansk, Poland in 1974, but it was spotted in a Dutch Art and Antiques magazine's article about an exhibition in the Gouda Museum in the Netherlands last year. Officials had first discovered the 1974 theft when a museum worker accidentally knocked the Bruegel painting off the wall that year and found it had been replaced with a magazine cutout upon examination. Until this point, authorities had not made much progress in their investigation into where the real work was. The woman carrying the embers is now in the custody of Dutch authorities, with Polish officials formally requesting its return, but the legal proceedings are just beginning, so we'll see how long that takes. And finally, honeys, a fragment of the Bayeux Tapestry has been found in Germany. It was discovered more specifically at the Schleswig-Holstein State Archive, which is part of the estate of the textile archaeologist Karl Schlabau, who lived 1891 to 1984. The tapestry in question is an 11th century one, embroidered and estimated to be nearly 230 feet long, 20 inches tall. It depicts events leading up to the Norman conquest of England in 1066, led by William, Duke of Normandy, against Harold II, King of England. Historians have long believed that a different section, supposedly showing William's 1066 coronation, was missing, but this section seems to have been removed from the underside of the known parts of the tapestry back in 1941 by Nazi scientific teams. It is undergoing examination and conservation efforts, and further findings will be reported as soon as possible. There's your buzz for the week, honeys. I hope you found something to enjoy. We tried to keep a nice balance of positive stories this week because last week, I admit, was a little darker. Take care of yourselves. Enjoy the increasingly warm weather. Hydrate or dihydrate, and we will talk soon. This podcast is produced, created, hosted, formerly edited, and fact-checked by master's degree holder Celia Bugno. Chris Meinhold is responsible for our editing, mixing, and our intro and outro music. Special thanks to him for that. And as always, remember to like, subscribe, share, comment, so on all your favorite listening as well as social media channels.